Hello there, welcome to session 12, where we're going to be looking at the stigma that's associated with substance use, in particular where that's addictive, and how to cope with that stigma and the associated shame. Now, people who get into difficulty with their substance use are often stigmatized by society, and that can have a knock-on effect to their families too, so maybe you've been stigmatized as well. What I'm going to be doing in this session is to be sharing with you what stigma is and explain how it happens, why it occurs where there's substance use, a little bit about the impact that can have upon the person that uses and on their family as well. And then I'll come on and present a slide at the end that will offer you some ideas other family members have found useful for how to cope with stigma and the associated shame. As ever, I'll be offering general information and you'll need to decide for yourself what of the video applies to the situation that you're in. Now, stigma is where society judges a subgroup of people, often for the way that they behave. And the purpose for this is that society is trying to make that subgroup of people other than the rest of us. And if they're other, they're disreputable, as opposed to being like the rest of us who are respectable. Thereby, by making a subgroup other, it keeps them away from us and keeps them down. Now, in the research, there's many reasons why society stigmatizes subgroups in order to keep them away and down from the rest of us. And three reasons that seem particularly relevant to problematic substance use are firstly where that subgroup is seen as dangerous or as a threat to society. Secondly, as a way to enforce social norms and values. And then also it could be a way for the majority to feel esteem by comparison with a subgroup who are seen as disreputable. Those ideas can be applied to addictive substance use, where society often views that behaviour as being dangerous. People who do it, who've got addicted, are no longer contributing to society. And all this deeply challenges cultural norms. However, this assumes that addictive substance use is somehow self-inflicted and could easily be stopped, that perhaps it's a lifestyle choice. And as we have seen in earlier videos, the reality of addiction is actually very different to that. It's important to note, obviously, that this stigma can extend to addictive people's families and friends as well, where they can be seen as complicit in their substance use. Maybe a family is being seen as dysfunctional. And again, the reality is often very different to that. I think it's important to note that there's a hierarchy in terms of stigma as well. And perhaps those people who are most stigmatized are those who use heroin, use it intravenously, and all the appalling stereotypes that go with that particular way of using substances. And then there can be many other people who haven't got into difficulty with their substance use, but who are still stigmatized through assumptions that they are like those people who have got into difficulty. At Adfam, we believe that the stigmatization of people who have got into difficulty with their substance use and those who haven't, as well as their families and friends, is unwarranted. And therefore we work to challenge that stigma whenever we can. I just want to say a little bit about what's the impact that stigma has on people. Well, generally speaking, I guess we can say that it adds insult to injury. For people who have got into difficulty with their substance use, the shame that they very often feel through being marginalized and stigmatized by society can actually lead to them using more. It can be a driver of substance use. And that's because they use substances to self-medicate the shame that they feel for being so stigmatized. And isn't that a cruel irony? Also, stigma can impact their mental health in an adverse way as well. And similarly, people's families and friends can be stigmatized as well, and that has an impact upon them. One common phenomenon of being stigmatized, whether you're the person who uses or someone in their life, such as a family member or a friend, is that through the shame people often feel, they withdraw from others, and in doing that, don't come forward and engage with sources of help and support. And that has a huge impact upon them and on their mental health. Therefore, it's important that you consider for yourself whether you feel stigmatized, and if you do, to think about how you may work that through so that you feel less stigmatized and maybe less ashamed. Now, broadly speaking, stigma for family members can happen in two ways. One is where you're on the receiving end of it from other people who stigmatize you or your loved one. But secondly, maybe you stigmatize yourself, where perhaps you might have bought into some of those social attitudes that are around addictive substance use, and correspondingly feel ashamed of yourself, of your loved one, perhaps of your family. So with this in mind, what I'm going to come on to next is to share with you ideas that other family members have found helpful, and present to you a slide that's got some ideas on how to cope with and work through stigma and shame. The first idea I'd like to offer you is that perhaps you have beliefs that are stigmatizing, either of yourself or of the person you're concerned about who's got into difficulty with their substance use. An example of this could be that addiction is a lifestyle choice. Changing the beliefs that we have can be difficult and can take time. But one way to do this can be to first be aware of beliefs that we have that we've now challenged and perhaps no longer see as being truthful. And then secondly, coming on to the next bullet point, one way to create new beliefs is to think of statements that you could make that you believe to be true in light of the reflection that you've made on the old belief. So rather than addiction is a lifestyle choice, you might want to say to yourself that addiction is a complex phenomenon that has many causes. And then when you catch yourself thinking of one belief, the old one, which you've now challenged, you can then say the new one. And then over time, what you may find happens is that the old belief begins to wither as it loses credibility, and the new belief starts to become more credible. That next point I've got is it's probably important to remember that many people who may be stigmatizing you may well misunderstand the true nature of addiction and of substance use. The next point I've got is whether it's possible for you to turn shame into anger and to challenge stigma when you encounter it. Now, what I mean by this is that the accusatory energy that perhaps you might have that can be turned against yourself or against the person you're concerned about, is it possible to flip that so that it comes out towards other people who maybe misunderstand the situation that you and your family are in and are stigmatizing you? That doesn't mean being nasty or being abusive, obviously, but maybe you might want to use that energy to challenge other people's attitudes about the person you're concerned about, your family, and possibly yourself. Now, having said that, it's important to remember that you have the right whether to reveal or to conceal. And I guess that probably most family members end up doing this on a case-by-case basis, where there may be times that you choose to challenge and to reveal, or you may choose that it doesn't feel safe enough to do that, or you don't feel strong enough in that moment, and therefore you choose to conceal. And that choice is yours. The next idea I'd like to offer you for coping with shame, and by shame I mean that awful, excruciating sense of self-consciousness, where we feel like we want the ground to open up and swallow us, is to find self-compassion for that, and maybe to try some calming breathing to calm how energized our body may feel when we feel ashamed. And I'll be saying more about calming breathing in session number 13. Next, you might want to find pride in the person in your life who's got into difficulty with their substance use, perhaps pride in your family. And pride can be seen perhaps as the opposite polarity of shame. And by finding pride, perhaps you can counterbalance any shame that you may feel about yourself, your family, or the person that you're concerned about. And then lastly, it's well recognized within the counselling field that it helps people to cope with shame by coming out to others in a safe place. So you may well want to find a support group where you can meet up with other family members who perhaps are also experiencing stigma. And through being with them in a safe place, being able to come out about what's really going on for the family that you're part of. And through that, hopefully finding that your shame reduces. And I'd like to end this slide by inviting you to think about other ways in which perhaps you feel stigmatized or the person you're concerned about gets stigmatized. And in particular, what I'm thinking about is perhaps where they have a mental health difficulty. There can still be a lot of prejudice and stigma about mental health difficulties. That again is often based on a misunderstanding. Perhaps if they're neurodiverse, they may get stigmatized. There's often a lot of stigma around things like autism. And then perhaps they get stigmatized for physical health difficulties that they have, such as being HIV positive. You could also apply the ideas on this slide to those forms of stigma as well. I'd like to end this session by posing some questions for you to think about. The first one is, you may want to consider your own experience of stigma. That may be from other people, or perhaps ways in which you might stigmatize yourself. And then look through the ideas that I presented to you that other family members have found helpful. And maybe there's some things in there that you might want to try to see if you can work through some of the stigma that perhaps you're feeling. I think the next thing I'd like to say is it's important to know you're not alone. There are many, many people in the UK who are in the same position that you're in, who are struggling to cope with someone else's problematic substance use, and who very often feel stigmatized as well. And then lastly, what I would like to do is to encourage you to get further support. And as I've said in the slide, that can be a good way to actually work through and reduce the stigma that you may feel, is by meeting with other family members in a safe place. And see the Adfam website for other sources of support. Okay, that concludes session 12. Bye for now.